This here is basically an example I showed you earlier in this module already. This is a standard React app not using Next.js at all, which uses a very traditional approach of sending a request inside of useEffect once this component is rendered, setting some loading state, and then displaying some data down there. Again, that's a very standard React-ish way, and of course there are ways of changing that, of handling errors, of using custom hooks and a lot of other things, but this is the most basic form of sending a request from inside React on the client side. And in the end, that's kind of what we now want to build again with Next.js here. Now for this, I'll add a new page here, a new route therefore, and I'll name it last-sales.js. Of course, this will just be a dummy page here. This overall project is just a dummy project. We're going to have a more realistic example in the next course section when we apply this to our events project again. But in this dummy file here, in this dummy page, I want to show you how we could implement client-side data fetching with Next.js. And of course, it starts with defining our page component here. And of course, we also want to export that component so that it can be found. Now in here, in that component, we want to return some JSX code. Let's say some sales data, which should be rendered as a list. But we want to fetch that data from inside this component function as well. We don't want to add getStaticProps or getServerSideProps here because that's exactly not our goal here. We don't want to prefetch the data on the server or during the build time. Instead here, we can now write useEffect, so use the useEffect hook, which we import from React therefore. And then in there, in this effect function, we can execute some code which sends a HTTP request. And for a useEffect, we also need to add this dependencies array, listing all the dependencies of this useEffect function. And in this case, this function won't have any dependencies since I won't use any other component-specific data here. So now in here, we can use the built-in fetch API, which is available in the browser. And as a side note, which could also be used in getStaticProps or getServerSideProps, it is available there as well. We don't need it there right now, but you could use it there as well. But here we use it on the client side inside of useEffect to send a request to some API, to some web server. Now to test this, we need some dummy backend, we need some web server, and I will use Firebase for that. It sounds like it's just a database, but actually Firebase is a service offered by Google, which gives you an entire backend with a lot of different features, but one of the features is a database with an attached API, which we can use as a dummy backend here. So we're not going to build anything complex with Firebase, we're just going to use it as a dummy backend. For this, you need to go to the console, and for this you need a Google account with which you should log in. And once you did log in, you can add a new Firebase project, and I'll just name it Next.js course, but you can of course pick any name you want. Click continue. You can disable Google Analytics, we don't need that, and create that project. Again, Firebase is a service totally detached from Next.js, which is actually made up of a lot of different services and tools and utilities, which you can use to build powerful backends for your application frontends. Here, I really just want to use its built-in database with a connected API. And that will be the real-time database which I want to use. So here I'll click on real-time database on the left, and there we then can click on create database. Now you can leave the default here, click on next, and on security rules, you want to start in test mode actually, which ensures that we do have access to the database from outside. Now this will create such a database for you. The great thing is that it will be a database into which we can look into here, and we also get an API here to which we can send requests which will then automatically be translated into database operations by Firebase. So we send regular HTTP requests to this API here, and then automatically data gets written, deleted, whatever we want to do here in Firebase. Now here I actually want to prepare some data though, so that we have some data we can fetch with our Next.js code here. Therefore, we can click on the plus here when we hover over this database name, and then add any key of your choice. I'll go with sales here, and then click on the plus here. And now we basically created a sales node, a sales table kind of, and we can now add different pieces of information that belong to a single sale. For example, here we could name this first sale, which we want to add S1, and click on the plus again and now add the data that belongs to that sale. Like for example, the username, which could be Max. Click on add now, and then click on the plus next to S1 again, and also add a volume of, let's say 100. And now let's click on the plus next to sales again, add a sale with the name of S2 and click on this plus, and here add a username of Manuel, and then click on the plus next to S2 and add a volume of 50. Click on add, and now we added 2 sales entries to this dummy database. Now I mentioned that it would be this URL which we can use to send a request to interact with that database. And that is correct. I'll copy that URL, and now here in fetch we can use that URL at least as a starter, and then here we want to send a request to the sales node and fetch all the sales. So here I'll then add /sales, and now in Firebase world we also need to add .json at the end. This is not a Next.js requirement. This is really just required by this Firebase API we're using. And this will send a request to this sales node in this Firebase database. Again, we just use it as a dummy backend here. Now, fetch, this built-in browser API, this function which is built into the browser, then returns a promise. So here we can add a then block to work with the response, which we actually get back here. And on this response, we can call .json to read the data from that response. That's how this fetch API works. Again, nothing Next.js specific. This is the standard browser fetch API and how we can use it. So now with that, we're taking the response and extracting the response data. This again then returns a promise. So we can chain another then call here. And this will then give us the actual data which we parsed from the response. And it's now in here, in this function here, where we can use that data which we received. Now we might want to update the state of this component to output the data down there once we did get it. And for this we can import the use state hook here and register a state in this component. Let's say the data state or the sales state with a set sales state updating function. And we call use state to initialize this state. And initially, let's say that's undefined because initially we have no sales. And maybe we also want a loading state, the isLoading state, so that we can show some loading fallback whilst we're waiting for that data to arrive. So here I'll then also set up this state, and initially it's false. And now in useEffect, in this function, we want to set isLoading to true here at the beginning, to set this loading state to true, because we are now fetching data. And once we got the data here in this second then block, we want to set sales equal to our sales data. And we'll do this in a second. And we also want to set isLoading to false here again, because we're not loading anymore. Now regarding the sales data, it is important to know that the data we'll get back from Firebase will not be an array, but it will be an object where these IDs here, S1 and S2, will be keys, which then hold the detail data as nested objects. So if we want an array, we need to transform this data. So here we can have our transformed sales, which is an array, and we build that with a for-in loop by looping through all the keys in data. Because again, data will be an object where our IDs, S1 and S2, will be keys. So then for transformed sales, we push an object into this array, and that object maybe has an ID property, which has the key as a value, because again, the keys are these IDs. And then we have our username field, which is data for the given key, dynamically accessing it with the square brackets, which is standard JavaScript, .username. So now we're diving into that nested object here, accessing the username. And we want to do the same for the volume, so I'll also add a volume key here and set this equal to data for the given key dot volume. Now I'll reformat this and it looks like this. So now this is how we transform our sales from an object to an array. And then I can set these transformed sales as my new sales. And that would be a very standard React-ish way of sending such a request. We can now use it and check if we are loading here. And if we are, I return a paragraph where I say loading, let's say, or where we show some loading spinner, of course. And otherwise here in the unordered list, we can also access our sales then, our sales state, and map our sales so that every sale is mapped into a list item where the key is set to sale.id and where we then output the sale username, then a dash maybe, and then after that the sale volume. And maybe a dollar sign in front of it, but that's just cosmetics. With all of that in place, we now got this client-side code. Now we can spin up our development server again to preview this. For this, I'll go to localhost last-sales, since that was the page name we added. And here I get an error, cannot read property map of undefined. And that makes a lot of sense because initially isLoading is false. And our sales state, which we try to use down there, is undefined. Now in useEffect, we change the isLoading state, but the way React works is such that useEffect only executes the effect function after the whole component was evaluated and rendered for the first time. And for this first render cycle, sales therefore will be undefined and state will be false. So we'll reach that code and we'll then try to call map on something which is undefined. So therefore I'll add another check and check if not sales, so if we have no sales yet, in which case I return no data yet here as a paragraph. Now with that, if we save this with this extra check added, now if I reload, you see loading, and then you see that data eventually. And that is how we could fetch data on the client side. Now if we inspect the page source here, then the interesting thing is that we see no data yet. And that hopefully makes sense. The page is still pre-rendered by Next.js, because I explained earlier in this module that that would be the default. A page which does not use get server-side props effectively will be pre-rendered by Next.js. The key thing here just is that the data used by this page will not be prepared by Next.js with getStaticProps, for example. Hence, when Next.js pre-renders this page, it will not execute this effect, it will not wait for this, it will not care about that, it will just return and pre-render the very basic first version of what this component spits out. And that is no data yet, for the reasons I explained a couple of seconds ago. That is the initial state of this page, and that is what gets pre-rendered therefore. So we still have pre-rendering going on, but without the data, because we're fetching the data on the client side now with this approach.